The account exists in two forms. The first is a stack of handwritten pages, 63 of them, kept inside a metal strongbox beneath the floorboards of a storage shed in Tucumcari, New Mexico, for more than 4 decades. The second is a recorded conversation, 6 hours and 11 minutes of it, made in the summer of 1994 on a cassette device purchased at a drugstore by a woman named Patricia Ann Simmons Caldwell, 3 weeks before her father was admitted to a hospital in Albuquerque, from which he would not come home. She had not been trying to document anything for history. She had been trying to hold on to her father. What she captured instead was the first time Everett Dale Simmons described, in his own voice and at full length, the 5 years he spent in a room beneath a building that no longer stands, performing a duty that was never assigned to him on paper, for reasons that no one who gave the order ever committed to writing. He had been asked to feed something that was not human. He had done it, day after day, for 5 years, until the morning he arrived at the room and found the door already open and the room already empty. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Everett Dale Simmons was born in 1924 in Quay County, New Mexico, the third of 5 children in a family that raised cattle on dry land and kept its affairs private. He enlisted in the United States Army in the spring of 1943, served in the Pacific as a supply and logistics clerk, and was honorably discharged in 1946. He returned to New Mexico, re-enlisted, and accepted a stateside posting at Kirtland Army Air Base outside Albuquerque. He was 23 years old. He held a standard clearance for a supply clerk. He had no background in science, no medical training, no intelligence work of any kind. The service record from that period, what remains of it, shows him drawing a standard enlisted wage, quartered in a barracks, attending chapel on Sunday mornings. Nothing in that record gives any indication of what was about to be asked of him. The summer of 1947 was not a quiet one in New Mexico. Whatever the United States military recovered from the desert outside Roswell in early July of that year, the official response moved with a speed that had nothing to do with weather balloons. Simmons writes in his notes that he was not told what had been found. He was approached in the final weeks of September by a man he refers to throughout his notes only as the Colonel, a designation applied without a surname across all 63 pages, who told Simmons he was being reassigned to a duty station that would not appear in his service record. The work was essential. It was in service of the country. Simmons had been selected because he had, in the Colonel's words, a steady way about him. He did not know what the phrase meant at the time. He understood it before the end of the first week. The room he was taken to was below ground. He describes the approach in the cassette recording with the same specificity he carries throughout the handwritten pages: a vehicle with covered windows, a descent by elevator, a long corridor with no markings he could identify, and a door at the end that required 2 men with separate keys to open. His daughter Patricia, who was present for the recording, confirms her father described that first approach in identical terms at every point in his life at which he referenced it, which was rarely and always in private: the covered windows, the unmarked corridor, the 2-man door. In 40 years of silence, the shape of that first memory remained exact. What was behind the door was seated when Simmons entered. He describes it in the handwritten notes with the careful, methodical language of a man trained to do inventory. He writes the height, the proportion, the quality of the skin. Approximately 4 feet and 8 inches when standing, a measurement he arrived at later through comparison with a filing cabinet he was permitted to bring into the room in the 2nd month of his assignment. Grey-toned skin of a quality he compares to the surface of an old mushroom, neither smooth nor rough, but suggesting something organic rather than mineral, something that responded to light differently than skin should. The head was disproportionate to the body in the manner of a young child's head, but taken further, extended, the cranium occupying a volume that seemed structurally impossible given the thinness of the neck below it. The eyes were the largest feature, Black in their entirety, he writes, and he is careful to specify what he means. Not dark brown, not very dark, black, covering what he estimated as more than a third of the available facial surface. No visible pupil, no differentiation of iris from what would have been sclera in a human eye. Just black, and a quality of depth inside that blackness that he returns to repeatedly across the notes, reaching for different language each time and never settling. It was not flat, he writes. There was something behind it. You could always tell. The mouth was present but minimal, a horizontal line below the nasal region that Simmons never observed opening in any functional way across 5 years of daily contact. The hands had 4 fingers, the joints articulating differently than a human hand, bending in directions he found difficult to follow initially and eventually stopped registering. There were no visible ears, the neck was narrow beyond what seemed structurally supportable, and yet the head was held with a consistent, deliberate stillness that Simmons began, after several months, to read as attention. The entity was always attending to something. He was not always sure it was him. He was not given a name for what he was looking at. He was told to keep it alive. What keeping it alive meant in practice took time to establish. The first weeks involved supervised trials conducted by men in white coats whose names Simmons was never given, who introduced various substances to the room and observed the entity's responses. Simmons was present for each of these trials not as a participant but as a fixture, because the colonel had told him on the first day that the subject had responded better to his presence than to the others. He was not told what better meant in measurable terms. He knows only that from late September of 1947 through the late spring of 1948, he was in that room for 8 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, reading, sometimes writing letters he did not send, sometimes simply sitting in the particular silence of that space, which he describes as having a quality different from ordinary quiet. It absorbed sound rather than merely containing its absence. What the entity consumed, ultimately, was water, and a liquid of a dark greenish color that smelled of copper, and something Simmons never found a comparison for. It was prepared outside the room and delivered in sealed containers. He was not told its composition. He transferred it to a shallow ceramic tray and placed the tray within reach, and the entity absorbed rather than drank it in a way that Simmons devotes several pages to attempting to describe and never fully resolves. The hands would lower toward the tray. The surface of the tray would be dry within minutes, no swallowing. No ingestion in any form he could identify or recognize as eating, only the evidence of it afterward. The tray, empty. The entity, continuing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In the second year, communication began. Simmons is precise about this distinction in both the notes and the recording, and his precision matters because what he describes is not language, not vocalization, not any physical signal he could trace to a source. He never heard a sound from the entity in 5 years. Not a breath, not a movement-generated noise, not any acoustic phenomenon of any kind. What he experienced, beginning in the winter of 1948, was something he spends more pages attempting to articulate than any other single element of the assignment. He calls it a knowing, not a voice, not a message delivered through a channel he could locate, a state of sudden specific knowledge that arrived without announcement, complete before he could examine it, the way a word arrives in the mind fully formed without any traceable moment of retrieval. He knew, on a morning in early January of 1948, that the entity was cold. Not because there was any physical change he could observe, not because the stillness had altered or the posture had shifted. He simply knew it, with the same quiet certainty with which he knew his own name. He requested additional heating for the room. The request was granted without comment. He did not explain to anyone why he had made it. He began reporting these knowings to the men in white coats, selectively and in neutral language, because he had assessed early on that what he said in that room was evaluated, and that how he said it shaped what was asked of him next. He told them it responded poorly when more than 3 people entered at once. He told them it settled, his word, it settled, when natural materials were present, wood, unfinished stone, unprocessed cloth, in a way that distinguished itself from its ordinary stillness, the way genuine rest distinguishes itself from mere inactivity. These observations were recorded. What was done with them, Simmons does not know. He never saw them again. His daughter Patricia confirms that her father told her, in the weeks before the recording was made, that he had never described the knowings to anyone. Not to his wife, who died in 1979. Not to his commanding officers, who received only the maintenance and feeding compliance reports he was instructed to submit. Not to the priest he saw regularly for the final 2 decades of his life. The knowings had remained inside him for 40 years, accumulating, shared with no one. There is a detail in the notes that researchers who have reviewed them return to without exception. It appears on page 31, in a section Simmons dates to the spring of 1950. He describes an afternoon in which the entity's stillness changed. Not through movement, not through any physical gesture he could document. The quality of the stillness itself shifted in a way he had learned by then to distinguish from its ordinary form. And then a knowing arrived that was different from the others, in weight, in texture, in what it delivered. What it delivered was not operational. It was not a physical need, or a preference, or a condition of the room. What it delivered, Simmons writes, was a feeling he had no word for at the time, and spent the remaining 40 years of his life attempting to name. He settles, on page 31, on the word he uses and does not revise. He calls it regret, not his own, the entity's. Researchers working in the field of reported grey encounter testimony have documented, independently and without reference to Simmons's account, a small number of witnesses to sustained contact with entities matching this description who report a moment of apparent emotional transmission that witnesses reach for the same vocabulary to identify. The word that appears most consistently across those independent accounts is not fear, not command, not threat. It is grief, or the nearest available neighbor to it, a transmission the human nervous system receives and classifies as loss. Simmons had no access to those accounts. He was not a reader of the relevant literature at any point in his life. He was a retired enlisted man in Tucumcari who kept his notes under a floorboard and his silence in public. The word arrived in him independently. It arrived from the same direction. In the early spring of 1952, Simmons arrived at the room for his morning shift and found the door standing open. The 2-man protocol had been observed without interruption across the full 4.5 years of his assignment. An open door had no precedent. He stopped at the threshold, and he knew, before he entered, that the room would be different. The knowing arrived the way it always arrived, without passage through ordinary sense. He went in. The entity was gone. The shallow tray was in its place. The temperature and lighting modifications were still in effect. The room was otherwise exactly as it had always been, and entirely empty in a way that rooms are empty when they have held something living for a long time and then stopped. He was told by a man he had not seen before that the assignment was complete and that he was being returned to his regular posting. He was given a document to sign. He signed it. He was escorted out. He never returned. The document itself is not in the Strongbox. Patricia Simmons Caldwell confirms that she asked her father about it and that he said only that it was the kind of paper you signed when they needed you to understand that what you knew was not yours to carry in the open. His personnel file at the National Archives, a partial copy of which his daughter requested in the 1990s under the Freedom of Information Act, shows a gap between the autumn of 1947 and the spring of 1952. The assignments bracketing that period are present. The period itself is not. A reference number appears in the margin of one intake document, a sequence of digits attached to no corresponding file, pointing at a record that the system acknowledges in its structure and cannot produce in its content. The gap is not explained. Nothing that precedes it and nothing that follows it refers to it. The missing years sit in the middle of his service history, the way a chapter number sits in a table of contents for a book whose pages have been pulled. The man who came back from that assignment in the spring of 1952 was not the man who had been sent in the autumn of 1947. His daughter knows this not from her own memory, because she was not born until 1957, but from the testimony of her Uncle Roy, her father's younger brother, now in his 80s, who confirmed in a conversation with researchers in 2011 that Everett had changed. Roy Simmons describes his brother before the reassignment as easy. The word he uses twice, unprompted. Easy with people, easy with noise, easy to have in a room. What came back was still friendly, still a good man, but careful. Everett became careful. And Roy says he would sometimes catch Everett listening to a room when there was nothing in it to listen to, a quality of directed attention aimed at silence, as though the silence might contain something he was responsible for detecting. He was listening for something, Roy says. He never told me what. I had my guesses. Turns out I was right. Simmons married in 1954. He worked for 30 years as a maintenance supervisor at a county facility outside Tucumcari. He raised Patricia. He attended church without fail. He kept the notes under the floorboard and, his daughter believes, went stretches of years without opening the Strongbox, because when she found it after his death, the ink on the later pages had faded in a way that suggested the pages had been revisited, read, and closed again across long intervals but not added to. The record he left is not the record of a man who worked through what he had experienced and arrived somewhere past it. It is the record of a man who learned, over decades, to set a thing down and walk away from it, and who found each time he came back that the thing had not moved. Simmons is not isolated in the documented record. The accounts that exist alongside his are few, and they are almost uniformly produced in testimony given in the last years of a witness's life, which may say something about the weight that sustained silence accumulates and the point at which a person stops being able to hold it alone. A man identified in researcher files only as WD, a civilian employee at a southwestern facility in the early 1950s, described to a researcher in 1991 a period of approximately 18 months, during which he was assigned to what he called an observation and maintenance role for a subject he describes in terms that echo Simmons's account with a fidelity that would be unremarkable if the two men had ever met. They had not. The height, the proportion, the coloration, the quality of the eyes. WD describes no knowings, no communication of the kind Simmons documents, only the physical reality of the assignment and the speed with which his transfer orders arrived when it ended. The transfer papers exist. The assignment they transferred him away from appears in no document he was ever able to locate. A researcher working this area in the early 2000s documented testimony from a woman in her 70s, a former civilian administrator at a facility in the late 1940s and early 1950s, who described colleagues who were sometimes absent from their regular posts for extended periods and who returned visibly recalibrated, careful in Roy Simmons's sense, attentive to silence in a way that distinguished itself from ordinary attentiveness. She did not see the entity. What she saw was what sustained proximity to it did to the people assigned there. That effect, the specific and lasting adjustment to a person's relationship with ordinary quiet, appears across these accounts with a consistency that suggests not coincidence, but exposure to something that changed how silence registered in the people who had spent time near it. The cassette recording Patricia Simmons Caldwell made in the summer of 1994 runs 6 hours and 11 minutes. She has allowed brief portions to be reviewed by researchers and declined to release the full recording, explaining this not as concealment, but as respect. Her father told her in the weeks after the recording that he had not spoken across all those years because he believed no one would stay with the account long enough to hear what it contained. He spoke at the end because he needed to have said it to someone who would not dismiss it before he was done. She held the cassette for 11 years before anyone outside her household heard any portion of it. What finally moved her to allow access was a detail a researcher produced in conversation with her about the reference number in the intake document and the gap in the service record, a detail she had not shared with anyone. The detail matched what she had found in her own Freedom of Information Act request through a different channel. Someone else had located the same absence from a different direction. She decided the account deserved to be heard. What the account requires, if it is taken seriously, is not a comfortable position. If Everett Simmons spent 5 years in that room, if the knowing was real, if what arrived in the spring of 1950 was accurately named as regret and originated where he believed it did, then the record that does not exist, the assignment that was never logged, the file the reference number points at but cannot produce, is not an administrative oversight. It is a decision. Someone decided that what Simmons experienced in that room had no place in the official account. Someone decided that those 5 years had no existence the record would acknowledge. The decision was made. The documents were managed. And Everett Simmons drove back to Tucumcari and learned across the remaining 4 decades of his life to set it down and step away and return to it in private and set it down again. He died in September of 1994. His daughter placed the cassettes in the Strongbox alongside the handwritten notes and has kept them since. She has been asked what she intends to do with them. Her answer does not change. She intends to keep them until the time seems right, and the time has not seemed right yet. She is aware she may not live to see it arrive. The notes will go to her children. The recording will go to her children. And somewhere in a federal records system, a reference number sits in the margin of an intake document, pointing at a file that is not there, pointing at 5 years of a man's life and whatever was at the center of those years that the official record cannot hold and has never tried to. Simmons does not know what happened to the entity after that spring morning in 1952. He was not told. He was told only that the assignment was complete, and the way it was said told him not to ask, and he did not ask. He signed the paper. He walked out of the building. He rode back to Albuquerque in a vehicle whose windows were no longer covered, watched the desert go past, and listened to the silence of the road. It contained nothing. He told his daughter that it contained nothing for the rest of his life, and that this, above everything else in those 5 years, was what had stayed with him. Not the room, not the eyes, not the 4-fingered hands lowering over the empty tray, not the word he had finally settled on in 1950 for what arrived through the knowing that spring afternoon. The silence that came after all of it. The silence that held nothing anymore. That was the shape of what it cost him. That was the transaction the paper had formalized and the record had erased. 5 years in a room below ground, keeping something alive, and whatever had moved between them in that time, absorbed into the official silence as completely as the liquid absorbed into the tray. No trace, no acknowledgement, no record that it had ever occurred. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.